Hello, you are very welcome to the extended Monday Roundup. My name is Andrew McGahon here on the MacLife.com. Every week we take two topics from our Monday Roundup on our Instagram and we look at them a little bit more in detail here, just expand it a little bit and given thoughts and maybe a little bit of background or information on the two things that we talked about. And UFC London was this past weekend, and before the fights on the Friday, they announced that the UFC were going to Liverpool May 27th this year, and Darren Till would be headlining it. Let's just go into the UFC Liverpool side of things first, and we can talk about that because they have had multiple fighters from Liverpool in the UFC before. They've had Paul Kelly, they've had Terry Adam and Paul Sass, guys that have trained in Cabon, maybe living on the outskirts of Liverpool, but in terms of just genuine Liverpool MMA fighters, we have Kelly, Sass and Adam. And straight off the bat, I can already hear it. I apologise so much for my voice. I picked up a cold over covering UFC London, and I sound a lot manlier, so I'm not too sure what's going on here. It was first reported by Pete Carroll and MMAfighting.com that the UFC were planning a return to Dublin on that same date. Now, that's definitely true. They were. The UFC, when they have a European date, they would generally have different stadiums on hold in different places. Now, they had started matching fights for UFC Dublin, so they were planning on that. What made them change their mind? I think that there is a couple of factors that maybe made the UFC decide, let's go to Liverpool instead of Dublin on this date. Potentially, the initial reaction, it seemed like with the prospect of Gunnar Nelson fighting Darren Till in London on St. Patrick's Day, that was a fight that got a lot of people excited. Notably a lot of Irish fans who would have been willing to travel over for that fight. Once that fight didn't materialise, for whatever reason, John Kavanagh took to Twitter at the time and suggested the idea of how about they do it in Dublin on that date. It seemed like both sides were up for it, both agreed to it publicly. John did a poll and he said, so 30,000 people are going to be happy with this, which is 3 times the size of the venue. So in terms of what they would be looking to do there, like sell out the venue, make good gate because it's a European event. It's not going to be pay-per-view in America. They want it to be as full as possible. That would have sold out the 3 Arena. That would have been a fight that people cared about. But whenever that fight wouldn't materialise for whatever reason, and I have been led to be told that Till's camp, when presented it, did turn down the Gunnar fight because it doesn't make sense at the moment. I can see where he is coming from. If you are Darren Till coming off a serious win over Donald Cerrone, that the UFC are willing to build you and willing to push you in Europe, you have to capitalise. The UFC want to capitalise on your next fight. Gunnar Nelson is one of the most experienced grapplers in the welterweight division. With that, you've got a very tough fight for Darren Till, who was able to showcase such an amazing style on the feet against Donald Cerrone. Darren Till is a guy who has spent a lot of time in Brazil. I am no doubt sure that he is very adept on the ground in mixed martial arts. But a fight like that would be something that you would likely have to prepare specifically for someone like Gunnar. Whereas with these short time frames between events and Gunnar coming off a loss in his last fight, there's an opportunity for Till and the UFC to build him in a much better way. I can understand why both sides maybe feel hard done by this. That it would have been a great main event for UFC London, a great fight for Gunnar because Till has a lot of hype around him at the moment coming off the Cerrone loss. Equally so, it would have been a great win for Darren Till if he were to beat Gunnar due to the level of Gunnar's ability. But because he's coming off a loss, they feel that matching him against somebody coming off a win or on a win streak would be better for Darren Till in the long term. Surely that is being considered by the UFC, by Darren Till and by all parties involved regarding his future fights or his next fights. So when it comes to the fact that they could potentially go to Liverpool, to an arena where Cage Warriors have already sold sold it out apparently, or like come very close to selling it out. Maybe it was a scaled back capacity, but there have been thousands of MMA fans, local MMA fans, in attendance to watch Paddy Pimblett fight in the Echo Arena. So if you put a guy like Darren Till, who is riding the support that he currently has, who is as scouse as they come, who is constantly referencing Liverpool, they have never had that person on a big stage to get behind. And this is exactly what has happened in Dublin, in Ireland in 2014. So I went on a tangent there. So let's just throw it back. The initial reaction from an Irish fan base, potentially that's what halted the confirmation. They were resigned to the fact that it could have been a fight night card. Following the Verdum versus Volkov main event that had been announced for London, were they going to be satisfied with something like that in their home city? In the venue that had given them such iconic nights in Irish mixed martial arts, like the Dublin event in 2014, that the UFC haven't come close to topping on that level scale of shows. When they did Gustafsson versus Johnson, middle of the night, amazing in Sweden. One of the best events that I've ever experienced live. But in terms of tribalism, in terms of emotion and atmosphere, they have never come close to eclipsing Dublin. The Irish fans had someone in Conor that they could know and think and push towards a title. And at the very least push towards the prospect, because at the time main eventing in Dublin, he had never fought in Vegas at that stage. So all of these potential trips to Vegas, which the Irish fans embraced, and thousands upon thousands descended upon Las Vegas, consistently following Conor to these huge fights. The UFC lapped that up. They loved that. They loved the tribalism that can follow a fighter. When it can potentially follow a fighter, they will get onto that immediately. And there is the potential brewing in Liverpool, in the UK MMA, that could happen again with Darren Till. That they could push Liverpool mixed martial arts, that they could put banners around the city like they did for the Fighting Irish when they were promoting the UFC Dublin event. I think it's crazy that the fact that the UFC didn't pull the trigger on the opportunity of finally having a UFC event in Dublin on Paddy's Day, and it was in London instead. Is that because they don't have the potential amount of fighters on the cusp, the same amount maybe say as Liverpool, who are ready to transition to this sort of platform and be able to get that tribalism, cultish reaction behind them? We don't have that, but I believe I have a solution to that. I'm going to speak about that in point number 3 later on in this. So I just want to leave that out there now so it's there so we can jump back to it in a couple of minutes, because with people like Paddy Pimblett, Molly McCann, I know that Ariel Helwani has been tweeting stuff like this, especially Chris Fishgold. He's exactly right in saying that all of those being signed would be led to like an essential promotion of the event, that it was being pushed to the forefront. As I said, banners, promoting them all ahead of their debut. Like, the UFC get people to shows in London because there's 10 million people living there, and because the UFC is a global brand, and because if you put someone like Jimmy Mano on it, then there is a semi-London interest. But I say semi-London because it's huge, because it is literally so big. You know, I went to the place where Jimmy Mano trained last week, and it's 45 minutes out of London. You know, it's south of London, but maybe traffic and all factors in a lot with that. But to me, it doesn't just seem like a place anymore with identity, you know, with like one sort of unity, which you would have something in Liverpool. Manchester, yes, for Bisping, but Bisping nearing the end of his career. Unfortunately, if Michael Bisping's career had started 7 years later and then started to develop and expand in like a social media era, I think he would have been a much bigger star in the UK. I think they could have pushed him much better, and he would have ended his career on a much bigger platform. Maybe not, maybe the dice wouldn't have fallen the same way and he wouldn't have captured a title, but in terms of like a potential exposure to an audience, a specific audience, Manchester would have got behind Bisping even more. I feel that the Liverpool people are a lot like the Irish in a way that they will support someone like this to the end, and that you can just imagine there potentially being thousands of Liverpudlians willing to travel to Las Vegas over the next couple of years to follow this guy, you know, to promote this guy. And again, I'm going to come back to that in a minute in point number 3. So those two ideas, because UFC London was this past weekend. Now, the event was very enjoyable, despite a lot of concerns, even from myself, maybe about what the card was going to be like. because a lot of maybe the lack of names or the lack of matches, and European fans maybe not being too happy with that as the main event. I suppose we can start there because they weren't too happy. You know, the reaction in the arena for Verdum when he was walking out was huge. You know, they were big Verdum fans. They were completely against Volkov. And by midway through the fight, they didn't want to cheer for Volkov, but they just wanted to boo everything because Verdum, despite showing good jiu-jitsu on the ground, never really seemed to take it out of first gear. And whether that was good defense from Volkov or Verdum just was taking the piss a little bit. You know, like there was stages where Verdum was obviously getting shots, and I'll just speak about this very briefly. He was in a deep half guard position that was really, really, really nice, that he was trying to swim under to the back. Now, he got it eventually. You know, he had just used it to come back on top. I think then Volkov landed a hard shot that made Verdum think, okay, I need to stop taking the piss a little bit here. But this is already in like the 3rd or 4th round. So he was already tired from the other 2 rounds where he was progressing and maybe not taking much damage. But then Volkov was able to get shots off on the feet that tired Verdum out. And that put him under a little bit of duress, a little bit of panic on the ground. So when he switched it on, and he hit the deep half sweep properly, getting both feet underneath the thighs, kicking forward, taking the back. And I think it was more like a mistake from Verdum that potentially cost him this fight, and that we're not talking about a Fabricio Verdum who glazed through the first 2 rounds before finishing him in emphatic fashion with a beautiful submission, the same submission that he submitted Walt Harris with in his next fight. And oh my god, Verdum against the winner of DC and Stipe would be huge. Like, we could have been talking about that for the sake of maybe 10 or 15 seconds. Verdum got to the back. Instead of working a choke attempt, from what I seen at the time, watching it live, I haven't watched the back. Instead of working a choke attempt, he switched immediately to the same Kimura grip that he used on Walt Harris, and then started to throw his legs over for the armbar. And in the transition, Volkov was able to get out. And for me, that was the end of the fight. I just thought Verdum went down from there. I was like, that was his chance. He's going to be breathing heavier now. He's going downhill here. And he did. He was finished in the 4th round. So, co-main event, Jan Blachowicz beating Jimmy Manu on a unanimous decision. The 30-27 I was a little bit mystified about. I thought it was quite an entertaining fight, a very tense fight to watch live, with Blachowicz dropping him in the 1st round. It brought on like a little bit of a stillness over the venue. But Manu obviously in the 1st round, or in the prior or further engagements afterwards, obviously landed a lot of big shots on him, because he was able to, like, if I was Blachowicz, I would have been committing forward a lot more after dropping him. Manu definitely nearly finished him with that head kick. He landed a head kick, I think a right head kick in the 3rd round or the 2nd round, and a couple of more shots probably would have put him down. You know, it was a really technical back and forth fight. I'd definitely like to see a rematch, a rubber match sometime in the future, but and just with light heavyweight being the way that it is at the minute, I think we may see that sooner rather than later. Tom Duquesnoy showed great striking ability against Terrion Ware. I know a lot of people thought Ware might have done enough to win the fight. Duquesnoy maybe just lacking some of the finishing ability he had in Europe. Seems like his striking is on point, but just maybe lacking that killer strike at the moment. I'm interested in seeing Tom Duquesnoy's further progression in the bantamweight division regardless. And then the other fights in the card, like the underneath the fight pass portion of the card, very enjoyable. Only one decision. Danny Henry over Hakeem Dawood. Danny Henry, Paul Craig, Charles Bird, Dmitry Savnotsky, all picking up impressive submission victories as well. But the other standout performer of the night, Leon Edwards against Peter Sobota, finishing him with 1 second left in the round, of the 3rd round. That was an amazing technical back and forth fight. Peter Sobota has developed a tremendously enjoyable jiu-jitsu game for the ground, to be honest. He has just gotten so good at being able to transition from positions. He had a lot of success with potential Kimura attacks on Edwards, but Edwards was so good on top and so good with his hands as well. And I thought that was a really big performance from Leon Edwards, and I think that what he did in the cage afterwards leads into point number 3, just like number 1 did. I think him calling out Darren Till in that spine tingling, like just a fantastic in-cage reaction from Leon Edwards. You know, Darren Till, you and me, let's go. I'm the best welterweight in the UK. Let's go. See you in Liverpool. Good luck. Show up. You know, to me, Leon Edwards took that opportunity. You know, now the finish on Sobota, it seemed a little weird, to be honest. It was weird, but he got the finish nonetheless. He was en route to a decision victory no matter what. But getting that finish just put that little bit more on top of it, that he was able to just drive that home to Darren Till. And this is where I think that the UFC could potentially reignite European mixed martial arts, their European scene in mixed martial arts. Okay, there has been such a tremendous reaction to someone like Sean O'Malley coming off the Dana White Contender Series. You're not expecting much due to records from those guys, different things like that. Why not get people behind these events? Dilute your product. That's what I'm saying to the UFC. Dilute your product. Change how you do things. I've been covering UFC events since 2013. Now, admittedly, it used to be from a pure reporting capacity. Now I'm reporting at the same things to create different content, or to create content. Now I'm reporting at them to create content. Now, I still do the same things. You go to a big fight, you'll go to an open workout, a press conference, a media day, 2 weigh-ins, and then the fight. So at a big pay-per-view, when Conor's fighting, generally you'd have a fight press conference and then an announcement press conference. When Conor's fighting, they know there'll be the most media there, the most eyes on the product. That's generally when they do their announcements for like the rest of the years or announcing other fights. Now, when the UFC do these things right, like when there's automatically a buzz, or where there's automatically a big crowd, or where there's high stakes, or where there's people fighting on a Conor undercard and they want to get heard and known and seen before the fight itself, you'll always tell when it's like that. You'll have busy open workouts, busy press conferences, busy events all the time on fight week. So this hit home to me last week while I was at UFC London. And for whatever reason, we won't get into the whys, but we'll just get into the facts. Especially with European MMA events, the UFC only have a media day on Thursday. Now, with the new early morning weigh-ins, when a fighter is sitting down to do interviews on a Thursday, they are well under 24 hours away from weighing in the next morning for their fight. A lot of them have started their weight cut. Maybe a lot of them don't have experience with weighing in so early in the morning, and they're having difficulty with it. Perfect example last week, Jack Marshman. I didn't do an interview with him, and to be honest, it was because I was standing around listening to him give interviews, and he was tripping over his words a little bit. Not in a bad way. You could tell he was dehydrated, and that he wouldn't have your full attention, that it potentially wouldn't be a good interview. And that's really the last place that he wants to be. You know, when you're doing interviews, you'd like to think that the guy is okay with being there at the time, not that he's being made to be there. And having that media event so close to weigh-ins, I think, is something that's dreadful. It needs to change. You're going to make the fighters start to resent the interviewers if they keep them for 5 or 6 minutes, or they're asking them questions that they feel, why am I answering these questions? They're going to give bad answers because they're not concentrated and they're not focused. And they're dehydrated. So why are we making them sit there putting themselves at stress or at strain or having to think about what they're saying when they're getting ready to weigh in? And it's because the UFC are trying to do a scaled version of what they're normally doing. So the UFC are trying to do like a scaled down approach of what you would see at these bigger events, but our model is the UFC, and it will keep being the UFC, so we can literally just pick it up, put it somewhere, and it will run. It will run like that. The European staff that the UFC have are among the best that they employ, and that's from having experience working those events with those people and with the American people, different people entirely. So people that have come and gone and left the company, on both sides. And the European side just seemed to be a lot more helpful. And to me, when they've had also bigger things, they pull it off very well with seemingly the limited resources, because it's not as big as an operation as it would be, say, if it was a huge event in Las Vegas. So the era of the UFC that will sell itself by its name, the Just Bleed, Face the Pain, this guy versus this guy, number one versus number two, that's becoming an aged product. And I feel that if you want the sport to grow here more in certain areas, to ensure that when you go back to putting on diluted cards in Europe, that more people will be more enthused about it for longer because you have a bigger fan base, maybe that have even transitioned. But you need to get people in through energy and atmosphere and entertaining fights coupled in on top of all of those things. UFC fans, and I say that like with quotation marks, those fans will still come. They're still out there. They're still going to go to the events. You know that you still have a core demographic of a couple of thousand people that are going to travel to virtually every event in Europe because they are diehard UFC fans. And that's perfect. You're not going to forget those guys because you're still going to have all the things that you would normally do. But why not give them more things to go to? Why not give them more things to do? So local fighters in the area / nearby countries where you know that fighters will have travelling support. This is what I mean about dilute your product. Change your product. Prelims to the main card. Let's say it's a 4-fight main card where you've got like UFC fights. UFC like recognised. You wouldn't have to do as many of these fights depending on where you go. But there is definitely a market out there because if shows like Bama or Cage Warriors are able to put a certain amount of people into stadiums, into arenas, I should say, like the 3 Arena being sold out, comprised entirely of certain Irish ticket sellers or certain Irish fighters. Or even looking at how Cage Warriors did it with Paddy Pimblett in Liverpool, yet the UFC aren't able to do it as comprehensively or with as much of an atmosphere, and that there's a deadening in the building when it's someone versus someone. And this struck home to me as well at the weekend when Fabricio Verdum was roundly cheered against Alexander Volkov. And due to his antics in the fight, the crowd, the local crowd that had no dog in this fight, started turning on him and then just booed both competitors. Because they're there for something else. They're there, as I said, they want to tap in to that tribalism. The UFC don't have anyone in Europe who'd be able to explain that to them. Maybe they don't have anyone at the highest table who'd be able to explain that, what they want there or what they need in these places. So sign these guys for 1-fight contracts. Literally, sign them for 1 fight. You don't even have to pay them as much because it's literally they're used to peanuts anyway. Maybe they want the Reebok experience. They want to get free gear. They've never got anything free before in their life. These guys want that. They want the decent purse. They want the chance to be seen. European mixed martial arts is full of guys that are their records 7, 8, 9-0. And the combined record of the people that they're facing is absolutely scandalous. Like they're fighting cans, get noticed, try get signed by the UFC. Meanwhile, you've got guys that are taking the hardest, best domestic matched fights and maybe are coming out like with a losing record because of how good and how close these guys are. And these guys would be dying to make an impression. Sign them for 1-fight deals. Bring them in on 1-fight deals. Use the resource of the local area. Put on open workouts for those guys somewhere, for example, in Dublin, in Liverpool, in London, wherever. And you're guaranteed to have an audience because their mates are going to come. Because people who know them are going to come. Because, did you hear about this fella doing this? Not, did you hear about generic UFC fighter from America doing an open workout in the square in Tala? No. Oh, did you hear Paddy Houlihan and Dylan Tucker doing an open workout in the square in Tala? That'd be packed. It'd be huge. There's absolutely no reason why they can't create this buzz around these events if they just change the way they're doing things. As I said earlier on, the success of Dana White Contender Series, just expand that. It's a Dana White Contender Series prelim. Dana comes over for the event. The fans would get behind that. You would also have copious amounts of fighters at a media day trying to make an impression for themselves, trying to get themselves viral, trying to get something out there, trying to make sure people remember them after this fight this weekend. Ireland England, both are full of fighters like that, who would take that opportunity, who would get out there, crack a couple of hilarious one-liners, get themselves a couple of viral clips. If they score a knockout that weekend, even better. Even better. Unreal. We'll build off that. Maybe the UFC will use them again when they come back to Europe to see if it wasn't just a fluke. Have these guys under the impression and the knowledge that unless you come out and show us how actually world class you are, you're not going to be re-signed. It's a one-fight thing. They will jump at it. They will jump. Coming from this point of view with the UFC and how they can potentially reinvigorate the European side of things, like, have no doubt about it, UFC Liverpool is going to be great. They're going to have a great build up to it. They're going to have great fight week stuff at it. If I was the UFC, I'd be announcing my rest of year schedule in Liverpool. Just so you guarantee it. The weigh-ins are going to be big. All of these things, we're not going to have seen the sort of energy and atmosphere since the Conor fights. And that's about it for the extended Monday roundup here on the MacLife.com. So extended, and so much so that I wanted to get a couple of things perfect. We extended it to Tuesday. Things will be back to normal from next week. We'll be doing an extended Monday roundup based off the topics on the Monday roundup as well on the MacLife. Apologies for the lack of visuals, mainly on this. We're in process of being able to do this to camera in the next couple of weeks. So that is something that is going to make it jump up massively. Yes, it will help when I shoot footage, say, at a local event and we're able to talk about that or break it down a little bit more. But for those that stuck through to listen just in audio format here on YouTube, thank you very much. And we'll talk to you next week.